Theresa May's plans for Brexit have suffered another setback, with MPs giving her 3 days to present new proposals if her withdrawal deal is rejected next week. Some Conservatives have questioned the impartiality of the Speaker after he allowed a vote on the issue. The car maker Jaguar Land Rover is to cut up to 5,000 jobs in the UK, blaming the slump in demand for diesel vehicles and the economic downturn in China. Police in East London say they've recovered a car used in the murder of a 14-year-old boy. A senior Conservative Party official has been given a suspended prison sentence for falsifying expenses during the 2015 general election. For a second time in 2 days, Theresa May has been defeated in the Commons over her Brexit plans by Tory rebels and opposition MPs determined to have their say on how the UK leaves the European Union. In a move which infuriated Downing Street and Brexiteers, the Speaker, John Bercow, allowed MPs to vote on a key cross-party amendment forcing the Prime Minister to present a new EU withdrawal plan to Parliament within 3 days if her deal fails to secure a majority in the Commons next week. Supporters say the motion not only prevents the government from running down the clock towards no deal, but also gives Parliament a decisive say on Brexit, enabling MPs to put forward their own alternative plans. Before the vote was passed, there were chaotic scenes in the Commons as Tory MPs accused the Speaker of flouting the rules by allowing the vote to go ahead. In response, Mr Bercow stressed he'd made an honest judgment.
The Chair has to make his best judgment there and then. That is what I have done, honourably and conscientiously, in the firm and continuing conviction that I am right.
This afternoon's vote came less than 24 hours after last night's Commons defeat for the government on a motion intended to limit its powers to change taxes in the event of a no-deal Brexit. Our assistant political editor Norman Smith reports on another day of high drama at Westminster.
Today's defeat for Mrs May could yet prove a pivotal moment in the Brexit process when the Prime Minister began to lose control as Parliament sought to reassert its authority.
The ayes to the right, 308. The noes to the left, 297.
The defeat, the second in 24 hours, served to underline how far the parliamentary arithmetic appears to have swung against Mrs May, with MPs seemingly set to reject her Brexit deal next Tuesday. It means that Mrs May would then have to return to Parliament within 3 days with a fresh plan, a move that would significantly curtail her scope for further delay. Crucially, the vote also enables MPs to put forward their own alternative proposals, such as a second referendum or measures to rule out no deal. Speaking afterwards, the former Conservative Attorney-General Dominic Grieve, who tabled the amendment, said Mrs May now had to listen to Parliament.
What I wanted to try to ensure was that there was a clear signal to the government that if the government's deal is defeated next week, we have got to have a serious dialogue between government and Parliament about alternatives, because otherwise we are going to end up, the crisis is deepening by the day.
Brexiteers, however, reacted with fury, accusing Mrs May's opponents of seeking to thwart Brexit. The Conservative MP Andrew Bridgen.
This is a constitutional crisis, because what problem we do have in the place behind you is we have a Parliament where most of the MPs campaigned for Remain. Many of them have never accepted the democratic will of the British people, which we gave them by having the referendum. And we now have a position where our Parliament is at conflict with the people. And I don't believe it's going to end up well for our Parliament.
Downing Street sought to play down the defeat, insisting Mrs May's deal remained the only one available. They also rejected suggestions the vote meant MPs could now force the government to pursue a different Brexit strategy. And the Prisons Minister, Rory Stewart, sounded this warning.
What Parliament's doing through all these amendments is creating some kind of dog's breakfast, where they're ending up with no majority for anything. In the end, we need to reach into moderate people who believe in a deal and get them to vote for it. This is, at the moment, a little bit depressing.
Downing Street, meanwhile, in an attempt to chip away at the opposition, confirmed that MPs would be allowed a vote before the Northern Ireland backstop came into force, and Stormont, currently suspended, would have a veto over any new EU regulations, a move immediately dismissed by the DUP as meaningless. Tonight, it seems, 1 month on from Mrs May's aborted vote on her Brexit deal, the parliamentary tide is now running even more strongly against the Prime Minister.
In highly unusual scenes in the Commons, the Speaker faced personal criticism and calls to stand down. Watching the exchanges was our political correspondent, Ben Wright.
Parliament is taking back control, and Leave supporting Tories don't like it. The latest move by the House of Commons to shape the course of Brexit prompted a furious response from several Conservative MPs who accused the Speaker, John Bercow, of inventing new rules of procedure on the hoof. Under existing legislation, the government has 3 weeks to come up with a plan of action if its Brexit deal is defeated in the Commons. But the amendment put down by Dominic Grieve sought to shrink that time frame to 3 days. The Leader of the House, Andrea Leadsom, wanted to know why.
I wondered, therefore, if you could please confirm that your decision was taken with full advice from the Clerk of the House of Commons and other senior parliamentary advisers, and whether you might consider, under these circumstances, publishing that advice for the further...
There was pandemonium as several Tory MPs stood up to question the Speaker's judgment and impartiality. One, David Morris, shouted that the Speaker should publish the advice he'd received from the clerks. The former Minister, Mark Francois, accused Mr Bercow of utter sophistry. Another, Crispin Blunt, said the Speaker should reflect on his position.
For many of us, we will now have an unshakable conviction that the referee of our affairs, not least that you gave your opinion and your vote on the issue of Brexit publicly, that we will have an unshakable conviction that the referee is no longer neutral.
Absorbing the hour-long barrage, Mr Bercow patiently explained that it was up to the Speaker to make a judgment about the admissibility of amendments. He said he had consulted the Commons clerks and was being scrupulously fair.
I understand the importance of precedent, but precedent doesn't completely bind for one very simple reason, which I say for the benefit of the Leader of the House, who is shaking her head, and it is this. If we were guided only by precedent, manifestly nothing in our procedures would ever change.
Mr Bercow said he was championing the rights of the House of Commons by giving MPs a chance to support Dominic Grieve's amendment or not. A handful of Tories joined opposition voices in praising Mr Bercow's decision. The Labour MP, Jess Phillips, mocked the Conservatives, complaining about the Speaker.
People only care about the procedures and protecting and conserving the procedures when they don't like the outcome of the thing that is about to happen, and never when it is going in their favour.
A majority of MPs then took their chance and backed the amendment. If the Prime Minister's Brexit deal is defeated next week, the government will have to respond with an alternative plan almost immediately, blunting one of Theresa May's biggest weapons against MPs, the ticking Brexit clock.
The day's events in Parliament are the main news in all the morning papers. May losing control of Brexit is the headline in the Eye. For The Guardian, it's May's power ebbing away as she suffers another humiliating defeat. It says the second parliamentary setback in as many days leaves the Prime Minister further constrained and increasingly boxed in. The Telegraph, the Mail, the Express and the Sun focus on the Speaker's decision to allow MPs to vote on the cross-party amendment. You're so out of order is the headline in the Express. The Mail, which produces an extract from its leader column on its front page, says John Bercow is an egotistical, preening popinjay who has shamelessly put his anti-Brexit bias before the national interest and is a disgrace to his office. The Times reports that Theresa May has been holding private meetings with Labour MPs to try to secure their backing for next week's vote. According to the Mirror, she's ready to accept Labour demands to enshrine EU rules on pay and conditions in British law. Britain's biggest car maker, Jaguar Land Rover, is to announce it's cutting up to 5,000 jobs from its UK workforce. The company's most recent figures show it reported a loss of £90 million in the 3 months to September after being hit by a downturn in Chinese sales, a slump in demand for diesel cars and concerns about Brexit. Management, marketing and administrative roles are expected to bear the brunt of the cuts to Jaguar Land Rover's 40,000 workers in the UK. But the BBC understands that some frontline production staff may also be affected. Here's our business editor, Simon Jack.
Today's layoffs are part of a £2.5 billion cost-cutting plan designed to combat a perfect storm facing the UK's biggest car maker. Sales in what was the company's biggest market, China, have fallen nearly 50% in recent months as consumers there hold back on big purchases amid global trade tensions. JLR has also been badly affected by the diesel emissions scandal as 90% of its vehicles are diesel-powered. Today's job losses come on top of cuts to the workforce and production in the UK last year. But Jaguar has been increasing its headcount elsewhere in the world. 4,000 workers have been hired in China since 2014. Production of the Land Rover Discovery is being moved to Slovakia with plans to hire up to 3,000 workers. The company has warned that a no-deal Brexit would cost it more than £1.2 billion each year, wiping out any profits. If, as expected, the UK bears the brunt or the entirety of JLR's global cost-cutting, the company may well say it tried to warn us.
Police in East London say they've recovered a car understood to be connected to the murder of a 14-year-old boy on Tuesday night. The teenager was knocked off a moped by a black Mercedes. 3 men then got out of the vehicle and fatally stabbed him. Detectives believe it was a targeted attack. Our community affairs correspondent Adina Campbell sent this report from Leighton.
Those who knew Jaden Moodie have described the teenager as outgoing and knowledgeable with an interest in nature. The 14-year-old had been illegally riding a moped in the Leighton area of East London when he was hit by a car yesterday evening in what police say was a targeted attack. He was then stabbed multiple times by a gang of 3 men and died at the scene. His death has devastated the community. Solomon says he was close to the teenager.
Jaden called me granddad. He was going to start the boxing training. His auntie and that they bought him gloves. They were setting him up. So it's not that Jaden didn't have any future.
The 14-year-old is the youngest victim of knife crime in London during the last 12 months. Since last night's attack, police say they've stepped up patrols in the area, including at local schools. Detective Chief Superintendent Richard Tucker is from the Metropolitan Police.
14 years old, and I think that will strike a chord with so many parents and so many people across London and the UK that could happen, to such a young boy. What were the motivations that drove 3 men, young men, in a car to do this act? Somebody out there knows who's done this.
So far, no one has been arrested, but police say they're continuing to make house-to-house inquiries as part of this latest murder investigation.
A senior Conservative Party official has been found guilty of falsifying expenses during the 2015 general election. Southwark Crown Court heard that Marion Little had become carried away with trying to defeat UKIP in South Thanet in Kent. She was given a suspended jail sentence. The constituency's Conservative MP, Craig Mackinlay, was cleared of 2 charges. Our correspondent Richard Lister was in court.
In the 2015 general election, Craig Mackinlay was facing a strong challenge from the then UKIP leader Nigel Farage in South Thanet. Tory Central Office sent a veteran party worker, Marion Little, to oversee Mr Mackinlay's campaign, and ultimately he prevailed. But a subsequent police investigation revealed that his campaign had spent more than £60,000, 4 times the permitted expenses limit, in the final weeks of the election. The court heard that many of the hotel, travel and salary costs incurred by Little and her team were never properly declared. Mr Mackinlay maintained that he hadn't been responsible for the expenses, and after deliberating for more than 53 hours, the jury accepted his innocence. Outside the court, he said election law should be reviewed to ensure that future candidates were not put through what he said had been a terrible ordeal.
It's been nearly 3 years of pure hell. For my family particularly, but I've got real thanks to the people of South Thanet. They knew I was charged with this offence just 6 days before the election of 2017, and they still supported me.
Marion Little was found guilty for her role in the submission of false campaign expenses and given a 9-month suspended prison sentence. The judge, Mr Justice Edis, told her it was suspended only because her husband was gravely ill. The Conservative Party has already been fined for failing to record expenses properly in South Thanet and several other constituencies.
A former cabinet minister in Israel has admitted spying for Iran. Gonen Segev agreed to plead guilty in return for prosecutors dropping the more serious charge of treason. He was extradited to Israel from Equatorial Guinea last year. Here's our Jerusalem correspondent, Tom Bateman.
Most of Gonen Segev's trial was held behind closed doors, a secretive prosecution of a former Israeli cabinet minister turned spy. Segev was an energy minister in the mid-90s, remarkable for little save his political shift from the far right to join a left-of-centre coalition, where he cast a decisive vote in favour of the Oslo peace accords with the Palestinians. Last year he was arrested, accused by Israel's domestic security agency of passing information to the country's arch-enemy, Iran. Since 2012, he had been practising as a doctor in Nigeria, where he was said to be in contact with Iranian embassy officials, passing on details about Israeli energy markets and security personnel. His guilty plea is not his first conviction. In 2004, Segev was tried for an attempt to smuggle 32,000 ecstasy pills from Amsterdam to Israel using a doctored diplomatic passport. His defence, that he thought they were sweets, did not persuade the court. He was sentenced to 5 years in jail for attempted drug smuggling. Tonight, he faces a longer term, 11 years, for espionage and transferring information to Iran.
Iranian television has broadcast previously unseen footage of the arrest of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe at Tehran airport more than 2 years ago. The programme accuses Britain and the BBC of attempting to undermine Iran. The images were shown less than a week before Ms Zaghari-Ratcliffe plans to go on hunger strike in protest at her 5-year prison sentence for spying and a lack of medical care. Our World Affairs correspondent Caroline Hawley has been watching the footage.
This is a recording of the moment that Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe was detained by Iran's Revolutionary Guards in 2016. She looks shocked as she's told she can't leave the country and must go to a police station. Since it was filmed, she spent more than 1,000 days behind bars, well over half of the life of her 4-year-old daughter. The Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt has pushed hard for her release, saying she's being used as a pawn for diplomatic leverage. Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe herself has threatened to go on hunger strike on Monday in protest against being denied specialist medical care after discovering lumps in her breasts. For her husband, Richard Ratcliffe, this is now a key moment in her ordeal.
What happens next week trumps everything. Nazanin has set an ultimatum, which is, I need to get medical treatment, otherwise I'm going on hunger strike. The Iranian authorities have a decision to make about whether to allow her to have that medical treatment or not. And if she doesn't, whether she goes on hunger strike. And we'll see whether it's a 3-day hunger strike or whether it gets extended. Fundamentally, this is Nazanin saying enough is enough.
Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe has seen some of the documentary. Richard Ratcliffe, who spoke to her this morning, says she was shocked by it and is worried that it means the Revolutionary Guards are digging in over her case.
The latest attempt to end the row, which has shut parts of the US government, has ended with another failure. Democrats say President Trump banged the table and walked out of their meeting when he was told he could not have the money he wants to build a wall on the Mexican border. From Washington, Rajini Vaidyanathan reports.
A dusting of snow fell outside the White House on what was a bitterly cold afternoon. The temperature outside matching the frosty atmosphere inside the Oval Office as President Trump and other Republican leaders met their Democratic counterparts. As the shutdown drags on, politicians have once again failed to reach an agreement to end the standoff and reopen government. Shortly after, the president tweeted that the meeting was a total waste of time. The leader of the Democrats in the Senate, Chuck Schumer, said proceedings were tense.
The president just got up and walked out. He asked Speaker Pelosi, will you agree to my wall? She said no. And he just got up and said, then we have nothing to discuss, and he just walked out. Again, we saw a temper tantrum because he couldn't get his way, and he just walked out of the meeting.
But the Vice President Mike Pence, who was also in the room, characterised events differently.
Well, the president walked into the room and passed out candy. It was true.
Never raised it twice.
I don't. I don't recall him ever raising his voice or slamming his hand. But this is a president who feels very strongly about his commitment to see to the security of the American people.
As this shutdown continues, some 800,000 federal workers won't be getting a paycheck this week. On Thursday, the president heads to Texas to the border with Mexico to state his case for tougher immigration controls once again. Polls suggest the majority of Americans blame him for the shutdown. Right now, he said he's happy for it to go on as long as it takes for him to get his wall.
The Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, has said British women forced into marriages abroad will no longer have to pay the cost of their rescue. The Foreign Office was criticised last week after it emerged that some victims had had to sign loan agreements with British embassies, compelling them to repay the cost of flights, accommodation and food. Mr Hunt said that in such cases, repatriation costs would be paid by the Foreign Office. Here's our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale.
In 2016 and 2017, the government helped 82 people return to Britain after they were forced into marriages overseas. The Foreign Office recouped the costs of many of the flights by imposing forced marriage protection orders where they could on those who had sent the victims abroad. But a small handful, about 8 to 12 people, who had no other means, were forced to take out emergency loans to pay for their tickets. And while they paid it off, their passports were taken away. This, not surprisingly, prompted some controversy when revealed by The Times last week. So now the Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, has announced the policy will change. Victims who would previously have been offered loans will no longer be and will get their flights free. Existing victims will have their loans written off and passports returned. Mr Hunt said people who'd been forced into marriage were exceptionally vulnerable and should be treated with compassion. Most Britons who receive consular help abroad will continue to pay for their travel home.
A lorry driver has been arrested after 27 suspected migrants were found in the back of his vehicle on the M6 motorway in Staffordshire. Part of the road was closed in both directions for about 6 hours, causing long delays. Richard Galpin has more details.
The police say they stopped the lorry on the M6 near Stoke-on-Trent because of concerns about people in the back of the vehicle being in distress. They said they had to act immediately. In total, 27 people came out of the lorry. Some tried to run away, but they were all detained. The lorry driver, a 42-year-old man, was arrested on suspicion of facilitating the illegal entry of people into this country. Those who've been in the back of the vehicle have been checked to see if they're all right after the journey. The incident caused long delays for drivers as the motorway was closed in the area for several hours. Amongst those caught up in the traffic jams were football fans heading to the match between Manchester City and Burton Albion in the Carabao Cup.
The BBC has learnt that at least 8 men in the UK have killed themselves in the last 6 years after being exposed by so-called paedophile hunters. Footage of the men was posted online after they'd been filmed by their accusers. The police have said they are best placed to deal with alleged paedophiles. Our reporter Catherine Nye has been examining the vigilantes and the impact of their activities.
Hello, mate. Bobby, yeah. You arranged to meet a 14-year-old boy here today for sex?
No.
Yes, you have, mate. Do you want me to get the stuff out and show you?
This is a sting by a self-styled paedophile hunter. Typically, such people go online pretending to be children and wait for men to ask to meet them face to face. When their target turns up, they're confronted with the team's evidence.
I've got all the chat log there, buddy. It's all screenshotted. It's all there. The police are on their way right now.
You're joking.
I'm a paedophile hunter, mate. It's what I do.
The BBC has learned that at least 8 men in the last 6 years have killed themselves after being exposed online by vigilantes. Most had not been charged with any offences. Leslie Henderson's father, Michael Duff, was exposed online and killed himself 2 days later. Miss Henderson says she has many unanswered questions.
The reality is he may not have actually committed any crime at all. We don't know. Because as soon as he committed suicide, the case was closed.
Ms Henderson says she hopes that by speaking out, so-called paedophile hunters realise the wider ramifications of their actions. Jamie Lee, a former hunter, says their tactics are justified.
Almost 50% of last year's convictions were because of teams like us. You know, when it's done properly and within the law,
I think it's fine. I think it should be possibly regulated even to get rid of the people that are doing it and causing problems for cases.
The National Police Chiefs Council has criticised the tactics used by paedophile hunters. It says that police officers remain best placed to deal with suspects and offenders and ensure that their often innocent families are looked after.
The parent company of Cambridge Analytica, the firm which was criticised for harvesting data from millions of Facebook users, has been fined £15,000. At a hearing in North London, SCL Elections admitted that it had failed to comply with a legal request from the Information Commissioner's Office about details it held of a professor working in the United States. For the sixth year in a row, no women have been nominated in the Best Director category at the BAFTAs. Catherine Bigelow became the first and so far only woman to win the award in 2010 for her film The Hurt Locker. She was also the last female director to be nominated in 2013. Our arts editor, Will Gompertz, has been looking at why women behind the scenes in the film industry appear to find it so hard to win recognition.
Did you just look at me? Stop it!
The Favourite is the favourite among this year's BAFTA nominations.
I am the Queen, but you are mad.
The darkly comic period drama is set in the 18th century court of Queen Anne, who is played by Olivia Colman in a warts and all performance which sees her nominated in the Best Actress category. The film has been lauded for many reasons, not least for having 3 strong female roles leading the movie, a sign perhaps of the Time's Up and Me Too campaigns having an effect. Or maybe a fig leaf masking an inherent bias against female filmmakers. After all, there were no women nominated in the Best Director category, and the percentage of major films directed by women is down from 11% in 2017 to just 8% last year. BAFTA chair Dame Pippa Harris says it's an industry-wide problem.
The Directors Guild of America did their nominees yesterday. They're all men. So it's something that all of us, I think, have to work on. Because there's clearly no shortage of women who want to direct. And if you look at the graduates coming out of film school, I think probably 50% are women. But they fall away very rapidly. And certainly by the time that they get to make their second feature film, the numbers are very low. I think less than 20% are women.
There was at least recognition for female directors among the other BAFTA nominations, including Lynn Ramsay's shortlisting for her film You Were Never Really Here in the Outstanding British Film category.
In the city, the 100 share index ended the day 45 points higher at 6,907. On Wall Street, the Dow Jones closed up 92 points at 23,879. On the currency markets, the pound was up 0.2 cents against the dollar at $1.27.5 cents. Against the euro, sterling was down 0.6 cents at €1.10.6 cents, making a euro worth 90.4 pence. Scientists say the discovery of tiny fragments of blue paint on the teeth of an ancient German nun sheds new light on the role of female artists in the Middle Ages. The pigment, known as lapis lazuli, was used for illustrating the most valuable religious texts. As our correspondent Mac McGrath explains, the chance find may mean there were more female illustrators than first thought.
The weird habit of licking the end of a paintbrush has revealed new evidence about the life of a German religious artist more than 900 years after her death. Scientists found tiny blue paint flecks had accumulated in a plaque that had fossilised on the teeth of the middle-aged woman from the 12th century. They believe the particles of the rare lapis lazuli pigment are likely to have collected as she touched the end of her brush with her tongue. Originating in Afghanistan, lapis lazuli was highly prized in Europe, where it was used to make ultramarine, a vivid blue colour so expensive that Michelangelo couldn't afford to use it. Researchers believe the woman came in contact with the pigment because she was a highly skilled artist involved in the illustration of sacred texts. They believe that their study indicates that many more women may have been involved in illuminating books than previously thought. Senior author Dr. Christina Warner says the study sheds new light on a time and a place that has essentially disappeared.
Nothing survives except the foundation of the building. There's no art, there's no books. It was kind of this site that had been forgotten and kind of written out of history. And through this work, we put it back on the map, and we've discovered another place where women were engaged in artistic production that we had no idea about.
The scientists hope that their technique will help them find other medieval female artists who were essentially rendered invisible from a history written mainly by men.
Football. The League One side Burton Albion have been thrashed by Manchester City after reaching the semi-final of a major cup competition for the first time in their history. They were beaten 9-0 in the first leg of the Carabao Cup tie at the Etihad Stadium. The headlines again. Theresa May has suffered another defeat in the Commons, with Conservative rebels helping to pass an amendment which forces her to come back to MPs within 3 days if her Brexit plan is rejected. The Speaker, John Bercow, faced calls to resign because of his decision to let the vote go ahead. Jaguar Land Rover is to announce up to 5,000 job cuts in the UK. Police investigating the murder of a 14-year-old boy in East London have found a car used in the attack. A Conservative Party official has been found guilty of falsifying expenses during the 2015 general election. BBC News.